Hello. Welcome back to the workshop series. My name is Colin Moriarty, and this time we will discuss general legal information about independent contractor classification in Colorado. As with all of the workshop series, this video is not legal advice. In 2018, NPR reported that 1 in 10 workers was an independent contractor. By 2020, Forbes magazine reported that nearly 30% of Americans were self-employed for at least a little bit, and 14% of workers were an independent contractor at their primary job. Whether you call it the gig economy or use an older term, many, and likely a growing, number of people in this country are contractors, not employees. Today, we will discuss why businesses may want to use independent contractors, what it means for a business to classify someone as an independent contractor, when it is appropriate and when it may not be, and talk a little bit about the Colorado statutes related to employees that are most likely to cause scrutiny of how a company classifies its workers. Our focus is on workers who make up a regular part of the business of a company. Now, you may have heard the term 1099 employee. This term is terrible and you should never use it, as you will understand soon. Regardless, the idea is that a business may wish to have some, perhaps all, of the people doing work for it act as independent contractors, not as employees. Now, being an employee has some benefits for both the company and the worker. It's a ready-to-go framework that is understood by people. The employee has a duty of loyalty to the employer that is difficult to replicate otherwise, particularly after Colorado's recent changes to its non-competition law. Theoretically, employees are only at will and can be laid off for no reason instead of having to comply with a contract. And there can be financial incentives for both the worker and the employer in doing this. Employees require that the pay be reduced to cover withholding, FICA, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, and so on. This can both make the worker more expensive for the business, reduce the take-home pay for the worker, or both. Another reason to use independent contractors is to compartmentalize liability. The law about a business being responsible for the actions of others, called vicarious liability, or respondat superior if you want to sound a ternat superior, is stronger for employees than for contractors. But it's important to understand that these and other benefits a business may gain from using contractors are the results of the classification, not the justification for the classification. In other words, they flow from a contracting relationship as opposed to employment, but they are likely not on their own a good reason that this relationship is appropriate in the first place. Now, as an aside, some people think that being an independent contractor is needed to give a worker flexibility for part-time or seasonal work. That's not true. You can typically do that with an employee. Similarly, the fact that someone's earning commissions does not mean they have to be an independent contractor. So, what exactly is an independent contractor? Interestingly enough, it's not typically a defined term in Colorado statutes, not by itself. It ends up being defined more as the negative space outside of employment. Colorado law does explicitly define who is an employee for many purposes: workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, wage and hour law, and others. If a worker falls outside of these definitions, is independent of the employer, but is still providing services under the terms of a contract, well, they're an independent contractor. That is the key insight here. When a business is classifying its workers, the real question is whether or not a worker is an employee. If the worker falls outside of that definition, but has a contractual relationship independent of the company, they may be an independent contractor. The question of whether someone falls within the definition of an employee or outside of it is typically fact-specific. The best way I can explain it is to say that if it quacks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it swims like a duck, and it looks like a duck, it might be a duck. The key thing here is that employment versus independent contractor is not a question of what form you fill out. You can't merely paper over what the facts show is an employment relationship to change it. Now, the paper matters. As we'll see, it can matter a whole lot. But ultimately, it's the facts surrounding the worker that justify calling him or her independent or not. The specific facts that matter, and which ones are emphasized, can be context dependent. And by that I mean that the facts of the worker's relationship might be analyzed differently depending on which particular law you're working with. Different statutes can have different definitions of employees and can be enforced by different agencies. Those varying definitions determine who falls inside of employment and who can be outside of that and independent. Let me give you some examples. Do you need to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act for a worker? Well, are they an employee under that definition of the law? The Act and other laws define employment and then give rules that trigger if someone is an employee. The Department of Labor enforces this law, and as a federal agency, the factors it emphasizes in deciding whether someone is an employee under federal law can change with the administration. Under Obama, the DOL used what it called the economic realities test. This test seeks to look past technical common law and determine whether, as a matter of economic reality, a worker is dependent on an employer. The focal point is deciding whether the individual is economically dependent on the business to which they render service or is, as a matter of economic fact, in business for himself. Under the Trump administration, the department published a rule switching the agency analysis to focus on really just two major factors: the nature and degree of the employer's control over the worker and the worker's opportunity for profit or loss. Under Biden's administration, the department is proposing to go back to the economic realities tests and break it down into 6 different sub-factors: the opportunity for profit or loss, investments, degree of permanence, control, whether the worker is an integral part of the employer, and the worker's skill and initiative. Each of these 6 factors in turn has many different sub-factors based on the specific facts, like whether the worker can decline work, whether they've made a capital investment, whether the worker has a particular trade or license, and so on. The Internal Revenue Service cares about employee status too, since they're taxed differently. If you go to its website, you'll see it reports caring most about whether the worker is under the control of the employer or not. It groups the question into 3 categories: behavioral, the control or right to control; financial, who supplies the tools, how they're paid; and the type of relationship, benefits, insurance, whether it's continuous or not. Now, other definitions of employee can pop up in statutes you wouldn't normally think about, too. So some statutes, like the Affordable Care Act, have a differing application depending upon how many employees a business has. If your workers are misclassified, you might be surprised to find that you are subject to more laws or higher penalties than you thought. Even federal copyright law uses the term employee in relationship to whether or not a work was created within the scope of employment. So it may matter here, too. Colorado, not to be outdone, has at least 5 different statutes that use the term employee for some purpose. The Employment Security Act, you would know it as unemployment. The Wage Act, Workers' Compensation Act, Anti-Discrimination Act, Equal Pay Act. And our courts have definitions that they will use when considering vicarious liability or the employee's duty of loyalty. And helpfully, these definitions can all be subtly different. It's not as bad as it seems, though. For all of the different laws involved, the definitions tend to overlap a lot. The language might change, the presumption might change, and your agency's views enforcing it might change, but generally speaking, the same kind of facts that make someone more likely to be an independent contractor under one law probably will be relevant, more or less, to another law. We're about to dive into a bunch of examples of these facts. Before we do, it's important to understand that no one factor, or number of factors, likely controls. There is no bright line, one-size-fits-all test that tells you when you need to classify someone as an employee. Instead, each factor pushes the needle a little bit in one direction or the other. The name of the game is to figure out which and how many factors are pushing that needle. The more things that indicate employment, the more dangerous it is for the employer to classify the worker as an independent contractor. Since you can't determine the breaking point with absolute certainty, there are cases where it's a question of risk tolerance. How likely is it that your company got it right? The only truly safe thing to do, if you want to avoid misclassification, is to make your worker an employee. That tends to keep the government happy. Okay, So, what factors matter? Let's get into some specific examples. First, the written contract. I know I said that you can't just paper over an employee and make them an independent contractor, and you can't, but the paper does matter. If you have a written contract that clearly indicates both parties wanted this to be an independent contractor relationship, that's relevant. Under the Colorado Employment Security Act, at least, it goes even further. So long as your contract has very specific language identified in that law, the employer gets a rebuttable presumption that the worker is an independent contractor. Control over the worker. A major component of virtually all employee definitions is control. Does the employer have the right to tell the worker what to do day to day? Is the worker supervised directly by someone in their duties? Is there a chain of command? Or, conversely, does the worker have freedom to choose when, where, and how to get the project done? Does the worker have the ability to work where they like? Or are they given a specific geographic assignment by the employer? Can the worker make the decision to accept or refuse projects or work? Or does the employer have the ability to dictate what the worker needs to do? And it's not just the level of control actually deployed that matters. It also matters whether the contract gives the employer the authority or the ability to exercise that control. Even if you don't use it, if the contract provides that the employer can dictate the means and methods of work, that will push the needle towards employee status. Another factor is customarily engaged in an independent trade or profession. Some professions have traditionally been seen as independent. In some cases, this is a legal requirement. Licensed and regulated professions like doctors and lawyers, there's such a case. These kind of trades require that individuals get certain kinds of education and pass tests, proving their knowledge before they're allowed to practice the trade. There are laws that specifically forbid these kind of professions from being employees of those not in the profession, because that would allow someone who has not passed the test to control them and interfere with their independent judgment. You may have heard of this as a corporate practice of medicine doctrine. Interesting policy questions arise here if you're interested. But getting back on track, there are other trades that are also usually understood to be independent, like electricians or other trade professionals. These are professions that require specialized personal skills, often their own specialized tools, licenses, certification, and training. They may require the worker to carry special insurance. They may relate to permitting requirements and inspection by state agencies to ensure quality of work. The more a worker is like this, the more likely it is not an employee. The more a worker is doing entry-level work, office tasks, or has been trained entirely by the employer, the more likely it is that they are an employee. Exclusivity. I think of exclusivity as really getting at the distinction between an employer and a customer. Does the worker get paid by customers or employers? And think about the difference between your plumber and a public school teacher when it comes to how many people are paying them. The plumber has multiple customers that she works for and bills, all of which contribute to her pay. The teacher may have only a single employer, the school, who issues one paycheck. Yes, I realize if you're a teacher in Denver, you may need to take a second part-time job to make ends meet, but hopefully that's atypical. The point is that the more you require the worker to work for your company exclusively during an indefinite period of employment, that will weigh in favor of finding employee status. After all, that looks more like traditional employment. On the other hand, if the worker is providing services for multiple customers, that starts to look more like a true entrepreneur. Now, a balance can be struck. Some employee definitions note that exclusivity for an independent contractor is okay, but only for short periods of time. So perhaps a subcontractor must work exclusively for a company during the length of a particular project to protect trade secrets, to do their part of the project. That can be okay. And also in line with my conception of customers versus employers, consider how the length of any temporary exclusivity is calculated. Is it project-based, lasting until a certain deliverable is achieved? Or is it time-based, like with a seasonal or a temporary worker? The more the period of exclusivity is project-based, the less the arrangement looks like employment. Quality standards. Similar to control, It matters how and to what degree the employer is able to enforce a quality standard on the worker. If the worker is given direction on what to wear, how to act on the job, how to speak, that all starts to sound more like employment. If the employer uses efficiency or quality standards to dictate the means and methods the worker uses to do its job, that also might push the needle in the employee direction. Does that mean a business can't give any direction to independent contractors? Of course not. But think of this as a distinction between supervising an employee on the one hand and defining a deliverable to a contract on the other. In the contract, an independent contractor can be told the design specifications, the deadline, and the other standards for the work product they're supposed to produce. But how they go about achieving it is supposed to be left up to them. Now, obviously, there's gray area here. Deadlines and deliverables can be defined at different levels of detail. But hey, since this whole employee definition is based on a lot of different gray areas, this is no different. The more detailed the contract is about what and how the worker does work, the more it might move the needle towards employment. Payment. Another factor is how the employee gets paid. Remember, at the outset, I took the position that how you pay taxes and calculate wages is more a result of properly classifying a worker as an independent contractor, not a justification for that classification. Well, that's only sort of true. Because if you do pay them like an employee anyway, that will weigh in favor of employment, and vice versa. If you give your independent contractors a salary, withhold taxes, provide health benefits, and so on, that will make it look like employment. It's just that this is not common because usually it's not in the employer's interest to pay these extra amounts. And it might be that avoiding these costs were part of the reason to use an independent contractor in the first place. What is more common is a business wanting to do other things that are common with employees that help streamline payroll and don't cost the business more money. So, for example, if you pay your workers by the hour instead of by the project, that's pushing you more towards employment. If you issue a paycheck out of the payroll system at all, if you demand contractors come on payday with everyone else to get paid, all of that can bolster the case for employment. On the other hand, think about how the plumber does it. He comes out, he learns what the project requires, he issues a bid, maybe verbally, and then he issues an invoice afterwards that usually has a payment deadline based on when it was issued. The more that your payment system looks like this, the less likely the case for employment. There are other ways that pay issues can influence classification too. Does the worker get benefits like insurance covered by the company? Does the company limit or track vacation time and sick leave? Does the company give advances? And if so, how are they tracked and repaid? Termination. One of the benefits to employment, in theory, is that employment is at will. A business can terminate an employee at its discretion for no reason at all. Now, some practitioners will argue that this is practically not the case anymore. I've heard the argument that there are so many different laws that restrict adverse employment actions that you may as well assume you can never fire anyone except for cause. I wouldn't go that far myself. But I guess I would have to agree that if you want to fire someone, it can't hurt to hire an attorney to advise you on what you can and cannot do. Firing is not a free move, necessarily. But anyway, the idea is that you can lay off an employee when you need to. But an independent contractor is working under the terms of a contract. To terminate that contract, you would have to do so under the terms of the contract, or because the worker breached. So the more that the independent contractor's contract gives the employer the right to terminate them without cause, the more it looks like employment. The more it has termination with conditions, notice periods, liquidated damages, or other restrictions, the less it does. Training. Related to the idea of being a tradesman, the more training that the employer gives the worker, the more it looks like employment. If the worker comes in fully trained, ready to go, independently established and licensed, less so. Tools and equipment. Who provides the tools and the equipment matters. If you have someone going door to door soliciting leads for your roofing company, are they driving a truck that your company provided? Are they using an iPad for contracts that your company owns? Or If we're talking about a hairstylist, does the stylist bring all their own scissors and brushes and bottles, or are they provided by the studio? Obviously, the more the employer provides, the more it starts to look like employment. Now, my impression is that there's actually a distinction here between tools and equipment on the one hand and materials and inventory on the other. That is to say, it probably moves the needle less to give your roofing crew the shingles to install, the materials used, than the nail gun that they deploy to do each job, and this makes sense, since an independent contractor might just be providing services and some other vendor might be providing the materials. Scheduling. Scheduling matters. If your worker is expected to punch a clock at your headquarters from 9 to 5, 51 weeks out of the year, that sounds more like employment. Similarly, required attendance at meetings on a weekly basis moves the needle that way. The perfect independent contractor schedule is no schedule. They're hired to produce a widget or a result by a specific contractual deadline, and how they do it is up to them. Entities. How the worker is set up business-wise also matters. If you are paying the worker in their own name and issuing a Form 1099 to the worker individually using the worker's social security number, that looks more like employment. Conversely, if the worker has established an LLC, corporation, or other business entity, and the Form 1099 goes to that entity under its EIN number, that looks more like an independent contractor. You're probably sick of me saying it, but there's gray area here too. The biggest area of gray here is trade names. I think of it like this. If you want to use independent contractors, trade names are the bare minimum. They're cheap to get, costing very little, and requiring 5 minutes on the Colorado Secretary of State. A trade name doesn't form an entity, but it does allow the worker to market themselves using that trade name. Since the trade name is just referring to an individual, it's not as good as actually forming a business from the perspective of proving independent contractor status, but like I said, it's the bare minimum. Combining businesses. If the worker's activities are integrated into or combined with the employer, that can move the needle towards employment. Does the worker have a separate office, garage, workspace? Or do they go to work on site for customers? Or do they have to go to the company's place of business every day? If the company makes the worker wear clothes bearing the company's logo, drive the company truck, and otherwise makes it look to passerby like the worker's part of the company, that persuades in favor of employment. Conversely, if the worker has their own logo, their own business cards, their own website, their own advertising, and so on, that looks more like independent contracting. Another question that some employee definitions care about is whether the worker's job is integral to your business. Can your business survive without them? Again, this is like the difference between a secretary who comes in every day to your business's core to do its job, and the plumber who comes in once a while to fix specific problems. Profit and loss. If the worker is truly independent and running their own business, if the employer is really a customer, then we may expect to see that the worker has made a capital investment in their company. They would have the chance to make money or lose money, depending upon the prices they can negotiate and how much their expenses are. If these elements exist, you're less likely to be looking at employment. On the other hand, if the worker gets a reliable paycheck no matter what they do, so long as they show up each day, that looks more like employment. Independently established. If the worker has their own business, there should be other indications of that, right? For example, the worker should be carrying their own insurance. They should be paying their own taxes, either through the entity or by filing a Schedule C self-employment form. They should have their own workers' compensation insurance policy from Pinnacle or someone else. All of these things help show the worker is truly an independent contractor. And that last point is worth a special sideline note. Even if a worker is a sole practitioner under a trade name or a business entity, that person needs to get workers' compensation. Now, if they're the only employee of their own business, they can get a form to opt out, but they must actually fill out the form to opt out. If your worker fails to get the policy and fails to opt out, in addition to looking more like an employee, this can expose the business to claims under Colorado law. Workers' compensation insurance companies can sometimes find ways of looking up the chain, even in cases of true independent contractor situations. Be warned. If the worker has their own workers, that makes the insurance situation even more important, but it also makes it look even more like an employment situation. So, a company that has a roofing crew of 5 people working for another company looks less like an employee than a single guy with a gutter truck. Now, everything we've just talked about is really some food for thought. There could be more factors. Ask yourself about the duck I mentioned earlier, or if that's too silly. Think of an electrician and a secretary. The electrician, an independent contractor, gets called to come out. She arrives in her own truck that she's invested in, pulls a permit to do work she needs a license to do, and use her specialized skills to fix your light switch. And then she gives you an invoice that you pay. The more a worker is like that, the more likely it is an independent contractor. The secretary drives to your office each day. He works at your computer on a list of projects you assigned. He must be at the desk from 9 to 5, other than breaks, and gets paid on hours worked on a regular basis without issuing any invoice or bid. The more the worker is like that, the more likely it's an employee. If you do have a true independent contractor, that's not the end of the work. The next question is, can you prove it? If some agency comes knocking based on a complaint, does the business have the information, the evidence, that can prove that the worker was not an employee? It's better to collect documents and evidence on this point before an audit, when everybody is happy. How can we do this? Well, draft an independent contractor agreement, with an attorney's help, of course, including the magic language. In that contract, make sure that the worker is warned about things that they need to do. Insurance, taxes, warn them they get no benefits, and list off the other relevant factors about the relationship in the contract, showing the lack of control, etc. And don't put in terms that will undermine the independent contractor relationship. And then, of course, actually follow that contract. You can also collect information beyond the contract to prove independent contractor relationship. It's far better to collect the documents and the evidence you're going to need to survive an audit when everybody is happy with each other. So what can you do? You can draft an independent contractor agreement, or more likely hire an attorney to draft one for you, including the magic language that the Colorado Employment Security Act wants. The contract can also warn the worker that it needs to get its own insurance, taxes, and that it gets no benefits. The contract can list off the relevant factors about control and the other things we talked about. The contract should avoid putting in terms that undermine the independent contractor relationship as much as possible. And once you have a contract, actually follow it. But that's not the only piece of paper you can collect. You want to be able to prove that the person is independently established. So, get a copy of the Secretary of State filings that they have made to establish their trade name or their business. Get a copy of their workers' compensation insurance or their opt-out form. Get a copy of the workers' insurance policy. Get a copy of the workers' business cards, or if they don't have them, go have them get business cards. Like a trade name, they're cheap. There's no excuse for not having these. Advertising materials, get those too. See if the worker is advertising anywhere else. It's cheap on Facebook, Yellow Pages, Home Advisor, Manta, etc. At an absolute minimum, you want to make sure, if you can, that your worker has a registration with online services like Manta or Google, showing that they can get calls from other customers. Get references from other customers that the worker has worked for. That also helps show that they are independent of your organization. Now, hopefully, this workshop has given you some idea of what an independent contractor is versus an employee, and why it is so important to get the classification right. I enjoyed sharing this with you, and I look forward to presenting future workshop topics. Remember, this is just a general overview of the information we present at our workshops in person in the Denver area. If you're interested in signing up for alerts on these workshops, please follow the links below to our website to sign up for our mailing list. While you're there, you can see our workshop pages showing you coming events, as well as look at videos for past events. Thanks so much, and have a good time properly classifying your workers.